Welcome to Costly Conversations. I'm super excited because we have Mike and Jake from Walk the Talk America with us this evening. And before we get started, I did want to just very briefly discuss something that I just found out very recently. A good friend of mine, Scout, he was a guest on the show and huge supporter. He actually was in a motorcycle accident recently. So if you guys are interested, if you have it within you, if you have a little extra, go ahead and check out the pinned comment down below. It is for his GoFundMe page. He broke his leg. He's not able to do any work right now. So obviously, we would really support, we would really be super thankful for any support that he gets. Obviously, do a little bit of homework, get to know who this guy is, and check him out. And now, onto the show. What is going on, fellas? Good evening. It's good to see you, Jake and Michael from Walk the Talk America, the Guns and Mental Health podcast. Or did I say that wrong?
Oh yeah, you got it. Yeah, Guns and Mental Health podcast. We yeah, we wear many hats, and I don't know what the
Yeah,
audience is into as far as verbal resumes, but
sure, sure. Well, I mean, you guys, both of you have done so much. I mean, really, if you just look at your bio and literally anything, it's like, 10 different letters, 15 different titles for both of you. Let's I guess we'll talk about Jake first, just because let's go from left to right on my side. Jake, who are you? Like, what have you done? What is interesting, I suppose.
yeah, I appreciate you teeing me up like that because we do the same thing with our podcast. What drives me batty is when I hear somebody like read off. I love Jordan Peterson to death, but he'll read like an entire like 5 paragraphs of somebody's bio or CV, and
Right.
it's like you're killing me. Just tell me who they are. So allowing the people to introduce themselves, I think, is a cool way to do it. So Jake Wiskerson is how you pronounce the last name for those of you who are curious, and I'm a marriage and family therapist by trade. So I'm licensed in the state of Nevada. I'm also a national certified counselor. And up here in northern Nevada, where I reside, I own and operate a company called Zephyr Wellness. We do outpatient talk therapy, and I've done a bunch in the community. I work with a lot with K-12 education, um, work a lot with youth. We integrate really tightly into our community. Uh, Washed up baseball player, home brewer, 2 dogs, one wife, 2 boys, 7 and 5. Like I said, not a lot of, not, I'm not really into the post nominal letters or the credentialism, but I have worn a lot of hats and sit on a lot of boards and coalitions and committees and stuff. So I can speak to a variety of things. But one of the really cool things I get to be a part of is this organization called Walk the Talk America, which Michael spent time explaining because he's the founder and I don't want to steal his thunder.
Of course. And Michael, let's talk about you a little bit. Thank you, Jake, but let's hear from Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Michael Sedini. I'm a third generation firearms industry professional. Basically got into the firearms industry because my family owned a massive importer, one of the largest importers in the United States for many years. 2018, I started Walk the Talk America, and that was basically a way to bridge the gap between the mental health community and the firearms industry. And there was really nothing before I started this that really tackled mental health. There was some suicide prevention stuff. I got here a very difficult way. In 2009, the owner of, or no, the president and dear friend of mine who ran my company, which is Eagle Imports, took his own life with a firearm. And I always thought it was weird that, the firearms industry, the 2A community, we have to accept so much suicide by firearm and loss, but there was nothing we could do about it. And I wanted to change that. So here we are today. Started this in 2018, and I couldn't have imagined this 6 years ago. If you'd have told me I'd be doing this, I'd have told you you're out of your mind. So
Absolutely. Wow, that's fantastic, and thank you so much for what you guys are both doing with the industry and kind of being a part of something that's a little bit bigger than yourselves. Obviously, both of you have kind of been in this space before, maybe a little bit longer than most people could imagine. So, really, I suppose quickly, like Jake, what brought you to Walk the Talk? I'm super curious about that.
Uh, that's a really good story, actually. So, I also host another podcast called Noggin Notes, which I've been doing for 6 years now, and coming up on 6 years. And what's really cool about Noggin Notes, if I can plug that a little bit, it's truly international, and not just because the internet's accessible by everybody, but it started in Cambodia by a guy named Safisa Rapinga, who knew one of my fraternity brothers from college because Lauren is his name, was working in the Orient broadly. They were both in China, Macau, working in the gaming industry, connected. They both moved to Cambodia, continued in the gaming industry. And at one point or another, Safisa said, "Hey, I want to do this mental health app called Noggin Notes," and talked to Lauren about it. Lauren said, "Hey, you should talk to my buddy Jake. He's in the States. He does this for a living." So we connected, and I gave him some input and guidance on that. The app became an app and a podcast. And then we found out that apps are very expensive to maintain. So the app went by the wayside, but the podcast maintained. And while I was doing this podcast about mental health and all its various iterations and presentations, one of my very good friends, also from the fraternity, also from college, named Jordan Slotnick, who manages our local premier range and retail store here in Reno, Nevada, called Reno Guns and Range. He texted me, asked, have I heard of Walk the Talk America? So this was early 2019. I said, no, I had not. And so I reached out to them. And for the listening audience who's not seeing me put it in air quotes, them ended up being Mike, basically running a one-man show. And I said, I would love to
Mm-hmm.
have you guys on my health show. So Mike showed up. We started talking. We did a podcast for an hour and a half or so, and then continued talking for another hour and a half or 2 hours after that. Became BFFs. Realized there was a lot of room to grow and explore this space, and I realized I had to commit myself to this endeavor. So I became the mental health of the guns and mental health that is Walk the Talk America. And Mike tells the story a little bit better than I do, but that was the launching of my role. To put a bow on the Noggin Notes thing, though, now Noggin Notes, because Safiso still lives in Cambodia, but he's originally from South Africa and has lots of family and connections there. We now have 3 Noggin Notes podcasts. There's Noggin Notes Cambodia, Noggin Notes Africa, and mine, which is the OG Noggin Notes, I guess, North America or whatever. But Safiso has found a niche in Cambodia teaching mental health, emotional awareness, emotional functioning, psychological, awareness to that population, which is in dire need, because broadly across Asia, Southeast Asia, and mostly the entire continent of Africa, they don't know about this mental health stuff because it was just never part of their culture. And so here comes this guy who's talking about it and sort of loosely connected to this podcast, and they've got youth who are connected to the interwebs and looking at what the West is doing, and they're like, "What is this mental health stuff?" And meanwhile, Cambodia, which suffered a genocide only in our generation ago, they are dealing with trauma and they don't know who to turn to because their elders
Wow.
don't know it either. So Safiso finds himself in this awkward position of like, well, I'm sort of loosely connected to this mental health stuff, but I'm not a mental health professional. But they've been leaning on him to do consultations, trainings, coaching, the likes of which has never been seen before in both of those demographic areas and geographic areas. So it's pretty cool to be a part of something like that that's truly revolutionizing the way an entire culture or cultures approach their interaction as human beings. So that's Noggin Notes. If you ever want to check it out, nogginnotes.com. And if you happen to be listening overseas, maybe if you're in Africa, you can check it out.
That is actually pretty darn cool. Mental health in Africa, like who would have thought? Because I think there's this conception, especially with a lot of the more recent um, things that have kind of like sprouted up in the U.S. and especially in the last few years, specifically around sexual orientation and things like that, and I suppose with Gen Z and the things that they've endured in the last few years, and I guess adapting from the Gen X and even the millennials and how we all interact, and then there's my little brother's generation, the Gen Zers, and it's like, wow, these guys are crazy, all of them, every last one of them. And then you see people like overseas and whatnot, and even some people like in the internet sphere, like in Africa, saying like, "Wow, you guys are all crazy," and then you know, come to find out, like people in even in what I guess this mythical land called Africa that no one ever really thinks about, other than maybe one or two things, right?
Right.
Um, there's needs there too that go beyond just food, water, and the things that people just envision when you say Africa, which Africa is a huge continent. There's a lot going on in Africa, but specifically where you guys are offering mental health care, like that's huge. That's really cool. Actually, um, my dad he went on a mission trip to Africa not so long ago, and it's like okay, a lot of people go to mission trips to Africa. There's a lot of people raising money for food and water, building wells, and important things. But who's talking about the trauma? That's
Right.
pretty cool. So thank you for that. I appreciate all the effort that goes into that. That means a lot to me. Um,
Thanks.
my guy Michael. So with your specific or Walk the Talk America, you act as the president currently, or you are the president. Excuse me. Was there any, I suppose, specific events that happened that really said like, hey, you know what, I really do need to kind of move this thing and make it happen?
So obviously, with the death of my president and friend, that was a huge factor because we used to talk about that all the time, right? We used to talk about how every year, like first responders or like active duty military would come to SHOT Show or NRA show, and a lot of them would just hang out in our booth, and then every year it seemed like we'd lose one. So we
Yeah,
used to always talk about it's such a weird thing that that person's like not here. We'd be like, "Where's Dave?" And they're like, "You didn't hear what happened to Dave?" And it was one of those things, and so it always stuck with me. But the light bulb moment actually came when I was in New Orleans in 2018. I was having we were celebrating a dinner. My national sales manager and we were pretty hammered, but we invited this lady to the table to have dinner with us because she was alone and she was an older lady and really cool and basically she was gun neutral, so she was like, okay, what happens during a mass shooting? And we're like, well, everybody blames the gun industry, which is us. I was like, we blame mental health, and then nothing ever happens. She's like, oh, that's a shame. She's like, how do you work with the mental health community to find solutions you guys can agree upon? And that was really the light bulb moment because my national sales manager like turns to me and he's like, yeah, man, we really should be donating like $1 a gun to mental health. Like he just said like this blanket kind of thing that really meant nothing.
wow.
But it sparked the idea in my brain, right? Because I was like, yeah, why can't we just donate money to mental health as the firearms industry? It'd probably make us look good, right? Like that's the way I was looking at it. I was like everything, you just want to throw money at something.
Right.
Um, but that was not the case. And here we are, like 5 years later. I could tell you that there was no just throwing money at the issue, right? You had to find real solutions, root cause mitigation, all those type of things. But that's the moment. I would say that's the key moment that really sparked it because when she said that, I became obsessed with it. And I thought about it at dinner, and I remember like one of my biggest regrets was not getting that lady's information because as we were saying goodbye, we were going to continue on to go celebrate, and she had a conference in the morning, so she was like, "You're going to do this," and I remember I looked at her, I was like, "Yeah, I am." She's like, "I can see it in your face. You're going to do this," and like I said, I wish I would have gotten her information because I think it'd be so cool for her to be like, "Wow, you did that!" Like you really took it to another level.
That is
Yeah,
my favorite story, by the way, that Mike ever tells. Mike tells a lot of stories, but that absolutely makes my eyes water every time he tells it. It's a
yeah,
great, great story.
yeah. I mean, just born in a moment, just a random comment, almost almost like a divine intervention. I don't know where you land on that spectrum, but it's definitely an inspired moment and just a random conversation. A random
Random
conversation. That's
conversation.
yeah,
Yeah, the weird part about it is because I've had so many people, and I don't, and they don't mean it in a bad way, but they're like, "Why didn't anybody think of this before?"
right.
Right? And I was like, "I know, right? Like, it just seems so simple. Like, let's just find what we can work with and what kind of programs or what kind of message we can have that could bring to, I guess, industries or communities together. And I always say, like, it wasn't rocket science. It just took somebody asking that simple question. Uh, I think there's a quote by Tupac that I always think of, or something like, "I'm not saying I'm going to change the world, but I'm going to have or say something that sparks the idea in someone's brain to change the world," or something like that. That's what that
Yeah.
always reminds me.
Spark a revolution. That's really, that is special. Now, what, I suppose, where have you run into any like roadblocks or anybody who's been like, oh well, you don't have to name names. Say like, oh well, this mental health thing isn't that serious, or
Hey, Roblox,
get,
Mike.
give us the tea. But
No,
you don't
no,
have to
it's been
name
smooth
names.
sailing the whole time. It's been amazing. Funding money falls from the sky, and you know,
Right.
Yeah, it's I will tell you, there's only been one organization that argued with me about. Jake, I always tell you this story. The NRA was one of the gun companies, and I went up there. I said, suicide is 2/3 of all firearm deaths. Uh, he literally just goes, "I'd have to see the numbers on that. I don't believe it." I'm like, "Sir,
Oh my gosh.
with all due, yeah, like with all due respect, like this is my lane, man. Like I'm not gonna just tell you a weird number, like But so besides that, I don't really think we get too bad of pushback. I think just people are afraid of it, right? Because the gun
Mhm.
industry, it's been so conditioned to hear mental health and like, ooh, gun grabbers. You don't want to mess around with that. Like we don't want to give
Right.
people ideas, but it hasn't been, there's nothing, there hasn't been anything like seriously major or any crazy stories of people just like
Right.
throwing me out. That's one of the reasons why in the beginning I did this. Um, for your listeners, like this was like a progression, right? It started off with me passing these bands
Hmm.
out at shows just to get the temperature, to get the reaction of people in the gun community. Like people would come up to my booth and I would just hand them like a wristband. It's like, oh, mental health, and then they'd share these crazy stories. And I thought, okay, we need this, right? Like this is the type of thing that is bringing out emotion in firearms owners. And then it graduated to me taking this flyer. I took this and made it into a flyer. I started putting in the boxes of my firearms, all the
And just
firearms that I
for the listeners, can you just read what's on the flyer, just for the listening audience?
Yeah, so the bands and the flyer basically lead to free and anonymous mental health screenings,
Hmm.
and you
you
can
should
go
probably
there and
talk about how we came about the wristbands too. That's a good story
yeah,
too.
that's a good story. Yeah.
Back
So,
up, back up.
uh,
Pull the lens back.
so my daughter one day, this is in 2018.
Hmm.
It's right after I found out that I couldn't just throw money at mental health, because when I sat down with people at like Mental Health America. And I was like, yeah, we want to give you money for programs for outreach to stop mass shooters and suicide. And they were like, well, we can write those together if you have any ideas. And I was like, no. I want to do the things that you talk about in all your papers and research and all that stuff. And it turns out that stuff didn't exist. So I was really at a low point because I'd gotten a lot of people in the firearms industry excited about what Walk the Talk was going to be doing. And I had to go back and meet with my board and tell them, like, hey, I don't think there's anything that exists that we can fund. And I remember Rob Pincus had said something. He's one of our board members, is a firearms trainer, and he was just like, "Look, anybody can give money to mental health. Like, what's going to make us special?" But it forced me to kind of look inside and say, "Okay, what are the things in the firearms industry that we can do?" And one of the first things was I was sitting in my office, and my daughter comes in, and she at the time, she's like 11. She's like, "Hey, Dad, I think I suffer from anxiety." And
Wow.
I was raised in a family, East Coast, New Jersey, Italian family, that if you said something like that, like if you said, I suffer from anxiety, I think I suffer from anxiety, they would have said, I'll give you something to have anxiety about. And
Yeah.
then you would never talk about it again, right? You would just move on because it was probably better for your mental health to move on. Um, so with my daughter was a teachable moment. I
Yeah.
said, go online and there's the Mental Health America. Go online because that's who powers the screening. I said, go online and take the screening for anxiety, because they have 12 different screenings. A couple of them are in Spanish, but there's depression, substance abuse. So all your listeners can go on there and check it out at WTTA.org. But I said, answer it honestly. No one's going to come knocking at your door. No one, no one's going to judge your answers. And I left it at that, and 2 days later, I'm sitting in my office and she comes in and she has the mail in her hands and she's like, oh, uh, Dad, I took the thingy, right? I was like, what are you talking about? I said, the thingy for anxiety. That's how she talks,
Yeah.
And I said, well, what did it say? And she had this big smile on her face. She said, I only have mild anxiety. And I thought that was like really good, because you see the relief in her. And I just said, that's a good thing, right? And she's like, yeah, it feels so much better. And she's like, it taught me how to like work on some things. And she's like, I'm going to give this to a couple of my friends. Right. And at that moment, I was like, oh my God, this little kid's going to go like through the school and start telling people to take this. This is exactly what the gun industry needs, right? Like they need an outlet. So, my first thought was, okay, do I put it on a flyer? And then I thought of the Livestrong bands. I was like, everybody loves these like rubber bands that people wear, especially kids and stuff like that. So I just started, I put it on the band, and then just started passing them out, like I said, at shows, just to check the temperature of, would this be something that like gun people would freak out about, and say like, oh, why are you doing this? Or, mental health. And it was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Just people coming up and telling their story and sharing their story, or sharing their suicide loss story, or just how afraid they were to go get help, but it's really not fair. So that's kind of the origin of the flyer, right? Because that's what it evolved into. And at first, I literally made the flyer, and I was a little nervous about that, because I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to be understood by, say, like the NRA or maybe NSSF, right, which is the National Shooting Sports Foundation. I kind of just wanted to see what would happen if they caught wind of it, and then, it, I put it in the box, and it was great, man. Like we would get calls, and people were like, I just bought a Bursa. Bursa was one of our lines, and they're like, there's this card in here for mental health. I just want to thank you. It was like that kind of positive, reaction to everything.
Wow.
So then I was like, okay, I'm definitely onto something. After a couple of months, I didn't get drummed out of the gun industry. I didn't get any comments, and I didn't get punished by anybody. So I just started going up to other gun manufacturers. I was like, hey, do you mind putting this in your box? And companies like High Point and Arms Corps, they were like, what is it? Free and anonymous mental health screenings for your customers. They're like, that's a great idea. Like, yeah, we'll do it. I was like, all I had to do was ask. That's all you had to do. Like it was that simple. So that's the story of the bands and the screenings and the cards.
Wow. That's I feel like I'm just kind of on repeat. That's incredible. Thank you for doing that. I personally haven't dealt with any ideations or anything like that. But like you said, it seems like every year, every 6 months, every couple months even, there's somebody else who either you knew or kind of were loosely connected to, or was kind of a big deal in the space. Like they were well known and well loved and had a beautiful family, and they seemed like they were surrounded by a lot of good things, and they were just dealing with things that they didn't really have, I guess, a complete grasp on per se. And it's sad to see. It's sad to see that perhaps somebody, maybe not every case, but in some situations, somebody could read a little pamphlet or see a band and be like, "Oh, somebody's thinking about me. Maybe I can take a step, making it easy."
It's one of the cool things that I get to be a part of is, so that same flyer, or a different version of it. Mike's talking about how gun boxes, some of them go into parts and accessories boxes too with different manufacturers. Arms Corps right now is stamping well, it's not stamping, they're printing the screenings link right on their ammo boxes So you buy a box of Arms Corps ammunition, it says take free anonymous mental health screening day, but there's a different version of the flyer that I'll hold it up for the camera, but on the back side, so on the front side it says mental health, it's okay to talk about it. Sometimes we struggle as firearms owners, we have a tough time admitting we need help, et cetera, et cetera. And on the back side, there's white space, and there's some numbers, but in the white space, a local practitioner or a therapy office can stamp their information on there or put a sticker on it. And so that's what I've done with Zephyr is, throughout the community, we've got these things sitting passively on the counters at ranges and retail stores, just right next to the cash register. You're ringing up your purchase or you're buying your lane or whatever you're doing, and it's just sitting there staring at you. Mental health's okay to talk about it. So there's this subliminal messaging that connects the mental health with the gun store that you're standing in, buying the thing, and then if you happen to pick it up and maybe stick it in your bag, you flip it over, and there's another subliminal connector that says this agency is cool, right? We're not gonna red flag you. I'm not gonna pick up the bat phone to .gov and tattle on you or whatever. You can trust us. And so it's really important for me to be connected to that so that we can serve a community that, frankly, my profession has done a very poor job of welcoming in. We don't deal with gun owners well. When I went through grad school, one of the courses, specifically focused on talking about quote unquote sensitive subjects like suicidal ideation and finances and sexual performance and sexual orientation and all sorts of things that you don't discuss in public conversation and at the grocery store or at the barbecue, right? Yeah.
Right.
And we never covered firearms at all. And it wasn't like, oh, hey, we're all in northern Nevada and we're all gun toting, rednecks. It was more like we've decided that guns are not cool and we're just not going to approach it. And the reason I concluded that was because later on, as I was floating in these circles throughout the community and various conferences or wherever I'd go, people would make condescending remarks about school shooters or whatever, and yeah, we know mass tragedy is terrible, but what they're doing is condescending the gun and by extension the gun owner. And I'm sitting there going, I'm standing right next to you, right? Like I'm one of these people that you're denigrating. And then I was like, no, wait, I'm not. You don't know that because I haven't told you. Why haven't I told you? Oh, because your impression of me. So when I joined up with WTTA, it was Mike tells us, he just reminded me like 4 or 5 months ago that when we did that podcast in 2019, I'd forgotten all about this, but I told him up front, I was like, hey, we can talk about your organization, but let's not talk about how I'm a concealed carrier and also a therapist. And it was because I was afraid of what my peer colleagues were going to think of me. Never mind the tens of thousands of people I could help, right? It was like, no, I'm worried about what Professor so-and-so is going to think. And it's like, that's such an inverted way of operating. I realized that if I was going to make an impact, I had to get out of the kiddie pool and step with both feet into the community and stop playing around with it. So I did. I say this frequently. I came out of the closet as a gun owning practitioner, and there was friction and blowback, and I don't care because those people who would judge me in that way are not nearly as valuable as the people I would serve who would otherwise never have rubbed elbows with somebody like me and maybe never would have gotten help and maybe gotten worse. And it's not just, we're a suicide prevention organization at our core. It's not just suicide. It's improved marriages. It's improved parenting. It's better boss-employee relationships. It's all the things, right, that accompanies attending to one's own mental well-being. So, and a lot of the work we do is with the veteran community too. And there's a lot of stigma and judgment within that realm. It says don't go seek help because doing so is weak. You might lose your clearance or whatever it is. Cops, firefighters, any of the tough guy professions. So you don't want to be deemed unfit for duty. Emergency room professionals, whether it's a physician or a nurse, it's like they don't want to seek mental health treatment either. So I've learned through this process, not just gun owners are afraid of coming into counseling. It's a whole array of people across many demographics for a whole variety of reasons that have nothing to do with Second Amendment rights, but have to do with occupational existence and family sustenance. So I've realized that we have a lot of work to do as a clinical community to tear down some of those barriers to care that are very off-putting. So one of the things we do as an organization that I'm very happy to have helped with is to create a cultural competence course to teach practitioners about what gun culture is. I certainly didn't know. I've been a gun carrier my whole life, but I wasn't into it. I didn't know that the community was so varied and so diverse, not just ethnically or sexually or whatever. It's politically and geopolitically and hobbies and interests and activities and beliefs and all sorts of stuff. And as I immersed myself into it, I realized there's a really there's a big bunch of people we could be helping, but are otherwise pushing away. So we need to become more culturally competent. We need to become more fluent in our language when we deal with gun owners who come into care. And that's not just mental health professionals. That's physicians, it's primary care doctors, it's pediatricians and dentists, because now they're asking dentists to start screening for suicide, and part of the suicide screening is asking if they own guns. And we need to be able to ask that in a competent way and not be clunky and off-putting to push people away from care, because that just makes things worse.
Yeah, you know, it's actually super interesting. My wife just got back from a pediatrician. I have a few little kids running around, and my wife said, "Hey, you know, it's interesting. They asked if we keep guns in the house." I was like, "Well, it's none of their business," you know, because it's not. But and she was like, "Yeah, well," I said, "Yeah," and then they said, "Well, are they stored properly?" And I was like, "Oh, I suppose that's a fine question. Maybe, yeah, but what if they're not? Like, are y'all gonna show up?" Like, and so
Right.
even as somebody who's like steeped in this space, who has the understandings of like kind of like what's good and what's not good, and who can actually do stuff to you and who cannot, even with all that, like these thoughts have gone through my head, like, you know, if the wrong person gets the wrong idea, someone could be knocking on my door, you know, asking more questions and then imposing the will of the state. And I know that's a huge concern for the people, and maybe, and that's a lot of the reason why you kind of put the steps in as you have, making it, you know, an anonymous mental health screening. Because I suppose a big concern is, you know, if somebody does pop up and say like, hey, you know, you have severe, um, you know, name a condition. Now they can kind of make a choice, and it's not, well, we you know, we're coming for you. We're gonna kick in this door. If you don't report yourself in 72 hours, we're gonna report you. And I suppose that is a benefit, so to allow people to become more comfortable with your process. So I find that to be exciting, and I also think it's quite a shame. And I think I've recognized this in my own life, although I don't ever really think about it. I just feel like maybe I'm just conditioned to the idea of coming out the closet as a gun owner, and even letting people know like I do like a gun podcast, and I, you know, do YouTube and stuff. And you know, it's like that isn't really a conversation you can just walk into the grocery store and people say, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" "Oh, you know, I do this, but I also, you know, big into guns." Here in East Texas, it's a little less of a big deal, but you go into the wrong place and that could be kind of a lot of weird looks. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
can appreciate you having um, that pause when you first got started, Jake. So and obviously
Yeah.
back
It's
to the,
funny.
yeah. Go ahead.
No, it's funny. Real quick, like, so like a lot of people call me the ungun gun guy because I didn't grow up around firearms, even though my family had a massive importer, but they weren't really firearms people either. Like they never like told me anything it was just nepotism, right? It was like, you're going to work for us as soon as you graduate college. And it's funny, they didn't tell me that I had no clue that people could hate you because you're a firearms owner. Like no one ever said like, "Hey man, you better be careful out there. Maybe tell people you work in sporting goods or something like that." So like I was just oblivious to it. And then I remember like the very first time I ran into it, and I was at this bar in Columbus, Ohio. I was like a traveling salesman for for the family business. Like when I first started, I met this girl and we were talking for like 45 minutes. She was like, I thought it was my future wife. I was like, "Oh, this girl's gorgeous. She's perfect." And she's like, "What do you do for a living?" I was like, I sell firearms." And she like jumped back and almost like visibly changed the energy, and of course started to let me have it. And at first I thought she misunderstood. Like I was like, "No, no, no, I just do it legally." I was like, it's like a legal way to do it, because I thought she was just like like almost like as if I was like filing off serial numbers in the back of a truck or something like that. But it was the first time like I had run into that, and I was like, wow, like people could literally hate you just because you're a firearms owner. I didn't know that existed.
You're muted, Aaron.
I say, yeah, that's really intense. Sorry. And
That makes for great audio.
no, it really does. Um, Super intense. And it's crazy that you actually, remember that story. And obviously you would. That's like traumatic. Like you really thought this was going somewhere and all of a sudden it wasn't. And not only are you not the right guy, you're literally a bad guy,
A bad guy too. The best part about it is like eventually I got to this point because I could tell she was like Ohio State sorority girl. You could just tell, like
Mhm.
because she told me she was a student, and at one point I think I kind of snapped on her. I was just like, yeah, it's great that you. I didn't use the word privilege because that wasn't the word that was being thrown around back then. But I
Right.
basically said, you're a rich girl who goes to Ohio State, whose parents probably paid for the tuition. I said, you don't know what it's like to have to protect yourself. And I remember like this bouncer walked by and she like stopped him. And this guy looked like the dude from the Green Mile. He was huge.
Yeah.
And she's like, tell him what you just said to me. Tell him. And I was just like, yeah, some people live in neighborhoods where the cops won't even show up if they're called, or they'll show up 3 hours later. I was like, and he looks at her and he's like, honey, I don't know where you're from, but he's like, in my neighborhood, I need to protect myself. He just walked off. Like,
Wow.
that was
It
the
just
that was
opens
the
the
end of the
door.
marriage. But it was like
Yeah. You got divorced before you got married. Come on, man. Jeez. That is wild. And just this stigma. And I think that might even make it harder for, say, the guy who, and this is kind of a prototypical example, and it's unfortunate. The guy does a couple combat tours, sees some really jacked up stuff, things that most people don't see. Comes back, is a gun owner, can't really talk about it because a lot of people might not understand. Can't talk about his mental health issues because no one's going to understand. And we're all conditioned that, if you have anxiety, then, don't have anxiety. Or like your parents said, I'm going to give you, or they might have said, I'm going to give you something to have anxiety about. And that's just wild. It's wild that even today, so many people are in this position. I think maybe the youngest generation is a little bit more open about their feelings and to the point where it feels excessive to me. But you guys, you're the more the professional per se, Jake. Maybe you can speak to that. But
Well, I mean, I'm glad you teed it up that way because a large percentage of what I do centers on emotional functioning and the neurological necessity of knowing what your brain is doing in response to the environment when it stimulates your brain. And I think what's gone on is we've made good efforts to try to plug that gap. But you're right, like kids don't know what they feel, parents don't know how to label it accurately, and we end up with confusing language to identify what we're experiencing. And we end up being very imprecise. And when we're imprecise with our emotions, we end up communicating poorly, often talking past each other and whatnot. And one example is, I might say, I'm overwhelmed. And you go, yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, I get so pissed when I'm overwhelmed. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not angry. You're identifying differently because overwhelmed is not an emotion. Overwhelmed is an
mm,
experience, and it's totally subjective to the user. Overwhelmed may be at its emotional core something like fear. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to accomplish everything that's being asked of me right now. So we end up using language that doesn't address the emotion. What happens in the brain, and I talk about this in my I have a whole video series on this. You can watch it on the Zephyr Wellness website. Just type in emotional functioning in the search thing, and it'll take you there. But what ends up happening is we don't validate what's actually going on in the brain. Therefore, we don't drain the limbic system. The limbic system is where the emotions come from. So when we're speaking in terms of emotion, but what's being identified as not an emotion, but a thought, something from the frontal lobe that we can change, that we can do something about, we end up being stuck in our emotions because we're using inaccurate verbiage. So say I'm overwhelmed, and you're like, yeah, that's I get so frustrated when I'm overwhelmed, and I'm like, yeah, um, but it doesn't satisfy the overwhelmed. So my limbic system keeps pumping chemicals. We keep talking, and maybe we have another beer, and then the subject changes. But I haven't resolved why I'm overwhelmed or what to do about it. All we've done is just shift the conversation. So now we take that into children. What's going on today? Well, social emotional learning. That's a big, buzz phrase. And we're teaching kids social emotional learning, SEL curriculum. And I'll just say that 85% of it's just total trash. It's just not good. It's not rooted in research. It's somebody's good idea, maybe, but it's not effective because the language is imprecise. Maybe, I don't know, 10% of it, 10 to 15% of it is a Trojan horse for some agenda that wants to, corrupt your kid and make them think a certain way. And then the remaining 5 to whatever percent is actually good. And there are some good curriculums out there. But the point is, not only did we go from not teaching well in yesteryear, now we're teaching poorly in present day. So we're actually devolving the way that children, and by extension adults, because all they do is age, and we're the ones teaching them, we're devolving the way that we respond to our environment in a poor way. Now overlay that with social media and constant stimulus and instant gratification culture, Amazon delivering your stuff instantly and Google returning your search results instantly and streaming services and platforms and all that stuff. We're in constant connectivity with one another. We've eroded our ability to tolerate distress, label it accurately, communicate appropriately, and we've lost things like vulnerability and intimacy, because through vulnerability you achieve intimacy. And the way this all ties together is if we're not attending to our basic biological necessity of knowing what our brains are doing, we can't communicate, we can't self-validate, we can't push through distress and get to the other side, know the world's not going to spin off its axis just because we felt an emotion. And we end up siloing. We go internal. We isolate. We intellectualize. We evade. We escape. We rationalize away. We explain things. Right? We do anything but deal with what's happening right now. And if you do that long enough, eventually your brain wears out. Your body wears out. You got neurochemicals like adrenaline and cortisol and serotonin that should be pushed through the system that end up getting stuck in your body at a cellular level, deteriorating your body. And once that stops working, because you can only overthink for so long before you have to deal with it, we reach for something like substances or aggression or violence, and that becomes the outlet. Some people get depressed, some people get anxious, right? And so we end up with these people coming into the clinic, for example, and in my office where I'm sitting right now, and we literally have conversations about what bringing you in today. It's like, well, I drink too much, or I can't stop thinking about the things that worry me, or whatever it is. And we go, well, how did you get here? And for me, it all comes back to, how are you tolerating your emotions? How are you functioning emotionally? And we need to start reintroducing this to basically everybody, but it has particular significance to the gun community because we're prideful on protection, preparation, being in control. And if you want to do those things, you also have to be honest with yourself about when you're not in control, when you're not prepared. And if we have an overarching message of quote unquote weakness that says you're not allowed to be weak, and we've conflated vulnerability, which is asking for help, with weakness, well, I'm just not going to ask for help. I'm not going to be vulnerable. It's like, well, okay, well, good luck learning that next skill set you might need when the power goes out if you don't want to be quote unquote weak. You have to ask somebody for help. And it's the same thing with your mental or psychological or emotional function. You gotta acknowledge that you need help and then ask for it. And hopefully you're asking for it from the trusted person who's not going to, red flag you, right? So there's many layers to this. And our job, I think, as an organization, as Walk the Talk America, is to try to demystify what some of that stuff is, break it down very simply for people who, lay people who don't work in my profession, and present it in a digestible format, while also telling the practitioners, hey, be sensitive to these topics around this particular group of people, because they're already skittish to come in and even acknowledge that this stuff's going on in the first place. Really long-winded answer to your question, but I don't even know if I covered it.
No. You definitely touched on some things that I want to continue on. But before we go any further, there's a few things that we have to do to keep this stream healthy. And of course, help the show. So real quick, let me see if I can't. Before we go any further, we do need to actually go ahead and pause the stream and change some stuff up. So if you're watching with us live, don't go anywhere. Just kind of stand by and we will be right back.